All right, philosophy fans, buckle up, because today we're going deep, it's like really deep, into a philosophical showdown for the ages. Think Ali versus Frazier, but with, you know, less punching and more intense thinking.
More wigs, definitely.
Way more wigs. It's Leibniz versus Kant.
And trust me, this isn't just some, like, dusty old debate from the history books. These guys were grappling with questions that are still, like, totally relevant today. I'm talking about the nature of reality, the limits of human reason, free will in a deterministic universe, all that juicy stuff.
It's the heavy stuff. But don't worry, folks. We've got an expert guide to help us navigate this philosophical jungle. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Leibniz's influence on Kant.
It's amazing. It's packed with insights into how Kant, took Leibniz's ideas, ran with some, and kind of demolished others.
So for our listeners who maybe haven't been, spending every waking moment pondering monads and transcendental idealism, can you give us the quick rundown on who these philosophical titans were and why their clash still matters?
Okay, so picture this. 18th century Europe. Science is like exploding, reason is king, and these two guys are right at the center of it all, trying to, make sense of it all. So you've got Leibniz, this brilliant, truly brilliant polymath, who saw the universe as like this perfectly ordered system governed by a benevolent God. He was obsessed with like finding a rational explanation for everything.
In Kant, he was more of a skeptic, right?
Yeah.
Always questioning, how much we can really know.
Yeah, exactly. Kant was like super impressed by Leibniz's genius, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But he also thought Leibniz sometimes jumped to like these really grand metaphysical conclusions a bit too quickly. Kant was more interested in, how our minds like structure our experience of the world.
So instead of trying to prove the existence of God or the soul, he's asking, like, hold on, how do we even have these concepts in the first place? What are the conditions for even thinking about this stuff?
Yeah, that's Kant in a nutshell. Like, he's all about the limits of human reason.
Okay, so we've got the optimistic rationalist versus the cautious empiricist. Talk about a clash of philosophical titans.
Right.
And it sounds like Kant had some pretty strong opinions about Leibniz's work. What was his overall take?
Well, it's definitely a mix of admiration and frustration. I mean, Kant clearly thought Leibniz was brilliant. Like,
Wow.
he really shaped the philosophical landscape. But he also felt like Leibniz had made some fundamental errors, especially, when it came to metaphysics and theology.
So kind of a philosophical frenemy situation?
Yeah, you could say that. But there's also this deep sense of engagement there. Kant wasn't just like dismissing Leibniz out of hand. He was really wrestling with his ideas. He was trying to figure out like, how can I reconcile this stuff with my own system?
So one of the big issues here is how to reconcile our scientific understanding of the world with, morality and spirituality.
Yeah.
I mean, science was painting a picture of a universe governed by deterministic laws,
Right.
Which seems to leave little room for things like free will or God or the soul.
Right. It's a big problem.
So how did Leibniz try to tackle this?
Well, his solution was this incredibly elegant idea, pre-established harmony. So he's basically saying that God, in his, infinite wisdom, created the universe in such a way that the kingdom of nature, the physical world, and the kingdom of grace, the realm of souls and spiritual truth, they're perfectly synchronized. Like, it's all planned out in advance.
So it's like two perfectly tuned clocks ticking in unison, but they're not actually connected?
Exactly. It's a beautiful analogy.
But Kant wasn't buying it, right?
Well, he was intrigued by the idea, definitely, but ultimately he rejects it. He thinks Leibniz is like sneaking in a lot of metaphysical baggage that we just can't justify based on our experience.
Okay, so even though they're both trying to bridge this gap between, the material world and the realm of values, they're taking very different paths.
Totally.
Leibniz is looking for this hidden reality of perfectly harmonious monads, while Kant is more focused on how our minds make sense of experience. And this difference, this fundamental difference, is really what sets the stage for their big philosophical showdown.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they're playing by different rules, and that leads to some really fascinating clashes.
Okay, so where do we start with these clashes? What's the first battleground?
Well, one of the first places where Kant takes on Leibniz is this seemingly basic principle, the principle of contradiction. You know, the idea that something can't be both true and false at the same time.
Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. Like Logic 101. What could be controversial about that?
Well, Kant argues that Leibniz's principle is both too weak and too strong.
Wait, how can it be both? That seems kind of contradictory.
Haha, right. And that's kind of Kant's point. He's trying to show the limitations of this seemingly obvious principle. So, on the one hand, he says it's too weak to rule out certain fictitious forces like, ESP, extrasensory perception, or the idea of souls directly influencing each other. These ideas might not directly violate the principle of contradiction, but for Kant, they're nonsensical because they're not grounded in any possible experience.
So it's not enough to just avoid logical contradiction. Our ideas also have to be connected to the world we can actually observe, the world we interact with.
Exactly. That's where Kant's emphasis on experience comes in. But then he also says the principle is too strong, and this is where it gets really interesting because this critique really gets to the heart of their different worldviews. See, Leibniz, he was influenced by Neoplatonism, which sees everything in the universe as emanating from God's perfection. So, like, even apparent imperfections or conflicts are just, limitations of our finite perspective. They're not really true opposites.
So for Leibniz, even even evil is just a lack of goodness. It's not a real force in its own right.
Yeah, that's right. And Kant, he's coming more from a Manichaean perspective, and he sees that as a dangerous oversimplification.
Yeah.
He believes that conflict, like real opposition, is fundamental to understanding the world. Think of like attraction and repulsion in physics, or good and evil in the human soul.
Wow. So even their understanding of like basic logic is tied to these really deep metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality and God.
Oh, absolutely. And this clash of worldviews plays out even more dramatically when we get to Leibniz's famous principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Ready for round two?
Oh yeah, bring it on.
Yeah.
All right, the identity of indiscernibles. Sounds like we're getting into some serious logic puzzles now. What's the deal with this one?
So Leibniz, always searching for that perfect rational universe, he argued that no two things can be exactly alike. There's got to be some difference, however subtle, to distinguish them.
So even like two seemingly identical grains of sand, there's got to be some tiny little variation that makes them unique.
Exactly. But Kant, well, he's always got to push back, right? So he uses the example of two drops of water. They might look totally identical to our senses, and for Kant, that's enough. He's saying that Leibniz is kind of mixing up concepts and reality.
Hmm.
Just because we can, like, imagine a difference, it doesn't mean there actually is one.
I see. So it's like Leibniz is putting a lot of emphasis on this hidden, perfect, rational order, and Kant's more focused on the limits of what we can actually know, how our minds like shape our experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this tension between them, it really comes to a head when we get to their ideas about substance and matter. Leibniz, with his famous monadology, he paints this picture of the universe as made up of these simple indivisible units called monads.
Okay, hold on. Back up for a sec. Monads, they sound like something out of like a sci-fi movie.
Haha, they are pretty wild. So imagine the universe not as made up of like physical atoms, but of these tiny little centers of perception and activity. Each monad, according to Leibniz, reflects the whole universe, like from its own unique point of view. And they don't actually interact directly, but their activities are all perfectly coordinated. You guessed it. Pre-established harmony.
So it's like a universe of like tiny little minds, each one experiencing its own little reality, but all in sync with each other somehow. That's a pretty wild idea.
Wild, but brilliant, right?
Yeah, definitely. But Kant, I'm guessing he wasn't totally on board with this one.
He wasn't. He saw it as another example of Leibniz mistaking appearances for things in themselves. He uses this analogy of a rainbow, right? A rainbow is a real thing. We see it, we experience it. But it's also just an appearance caused by, sunlight refracting through water droplets.
Right, right. So just because we perceive something doesn't mean we're seeing like its true essence. And the monads, for Kant, they're kind of like another rainbow, a
Right.
product of our minds, not not some fundamental building block of reality.
Exactly. Kant's point is that Leibniz is trying to explain the universe based on what we perceive, rather than focusing on the underlying structures of our minds, the structures that make those perceptions possible in the first place.
Okay, this is getting pretty meta. And speaking of structures, we can't talk about Kant without talking about his pretty revolutionary views on space and time.
Oh, yeah, this is where things get really mind-bending. Remember, Leibniz saw space and time as relational. They're not like independent containers, but they're defined by their relationships between objects.
So no objects, no space and time. It's like a physics brain teaser.
Right. But Kant, he takes a totally different approach. He says that space and time, they aren't out there in the world. They're pure forms of intuition, meaning they're built into the very structure of how we experience things.
So Leibniz is grounding space and time in the external world, and Kant is putting them like firmly in the human mind. That's a huge difference. What are the implications of that?
Well, for one thing, it totally changes how we think about knowledge and the whole relationship between our minds and reality. And it has big implications for the debates on free will and determinism, which, as you know, were central to both Leibniz and Kant.
Okay, let's get into that. Free will versus determinism, the age-old question. Are we really in control of our choices, or are we just, cogs in some giant cosmic machine?
Yeah, and these two definitely had very different answers. So Leibniz, with his principle of sufficient reason, he leans heavily towards determinism. He's saying that every event, even, human actions, has a cause, a sufficient reason for happening.
So even if it feels like we're making free choices, it's all just an illusion. Like our actions were already set in motion, way back at the beginning of the universe.
That's basically the Leibnizian view. But Kant, he saw this as completely undermining like the whole idea of morality. If we're not really free, how can we be held responsible for anything? He even compared Leibniz's view of freedom to that of a turnspit, like a mechanical device for roasting meat.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Not exactly a flattering comparison.
Yeah.
So how did Kant try to reconcile free will with this world that seems to be governed by deterministic laws?
It's one of the toughest parts of his philosophy. He knows the arguments for determinism are strong, but he insists that we have to believe in free will if we want morality to even be possible. He calls freedom a practical necessity, something we kind of have to assume if we want to, act morally and hold ourselves and others accountable.
So it's not about like proving that free will exists in some absolute sense, but more about choosing to believe in it because the alternative is, well, ethically unacceptable.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole debate about free will, it's just one example of how these two thinkers, even though they're grappling with the same fundamental questions, they come to these radically different conclusions. And these differences, they just keep popping up as we dig deeper into their thoughts on, the mind-body problem, the nature of God, the idea of progress.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep digging.
Uh,
Lead the way. Okay, so we're back for the final round of Leibniz versus Kant. It's been quite a journey. My head is spinning with all these metaphysical concepts.
a lot to take in, that's for sure. But it's also, incredibly stimulating. I mean, these guys were really wrestling with some of the deepest questions we can ask.
Yeah, totally. And what's so amazing is how relevant their debates still feel today. Like they were grappling with the same stuff we're still trying to figure out. How do our minds make sense of reality? Is there free will in a deterministic universe? What's the relationship between science and reason and faith? It's all still up for grabs.
Yeah, and they offered such different answers. Remember Leibniz with his optimistic view of a perfectly harmonious universe?
Yeah, like everything's got its place. It's all part of God's plan, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But then you have Kant, always the skeptic, pushing back on those grand metaphysical claims. Instead of trying to prove the existence of God or the soul, he's more interested in like how our minds structure our experience of the world.
Right, right. He's all about, the limits of human reason. Like, what can we really know and how do we even know it?
Remember that rainbow analogy we talked about? How Kant saw the monads as another example of Leibniz mistaking appearances for things in themselves?
Oh, yeah. That was a good one. It really highlighted how Kant was always trying to draw this distinction between how things appear to us and how they actually are.
And that distinction was crucial for his critiques of, a lot of Leibniz's other ideas, like the principle of sufficient reason and the identity of indiscernibles. Kant was always pushing back against what he saw as Leibniz's tendency to like overreach with reason, to make these big claims about reality that just couldn't be justified based on experience.
But it wasn't all disagreement, right? I mean, there were some areas where they seemed to be kind of on similar wavelengths, at least in terms of the questions they were asking.
Totally. Think about the mind-body problem. Both Leibniz and Kant were trying to figure out how our immaterial minds interact with our physical bodies.
And they both struggled with it
Yeah.
in different ways.
Right. Leibniz, with his pre-established harmony, he came up with this idea of the mind and body being like perfectly synchronized, like two clocks running in parallel, but not actually influencing each other directly.
But Kant, he initially entertained this idea of influx, this notion of a direct causal link between mind and body. But eventually he kind of rejects dualism altogether. He suggests that maybe there's this deeper unknowable ground for both mind and matter. It's a really fascinating idea.
It is. It really anticipates some of the later developments in philosophy and even, in science.
And then, of course, there's the whole free will versus determinism debate. Leibniz, with his emphasis on sufficient reason, seemed to be leaning towards this view where our actions are basically predetermined.
Right, but Kant saw that as a fundamental threat to the whole idea of morality. If we're not really free, how can we be held responsible for our choices?
His solution that freedom is a practical necessity, something we must presuppose to act morally, it's a pretty bold move. He's basically saying, look, I can't prove that free will exists in some, absolute metaphysical sense, but we have to act as if it does, because the alternative is just, it's just too horrible.
It's such a classic Kantian move. He's acknowledging the limits of reason, but he's also insisting on its importance for guiding our actions and, making sense of our lives.
So where does all this leave us? What are the key takeaways from this whole philosophical showdown?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is this. Both Leibniz and Kant were grappling with how to reconcile the growing power of science and reason with our deep human needs for meaning, for morality, for a sense of purpose.
Yeah, it's like Leibniz tried to create this system where everything fit together perfectly, where reason could explain it all. But Kant was a bit more humble, more aware of the limitations of what we can know.
Exactly. And he showed us that even though we can't have absolute certainty about things like God or freedom or the nature of reality, reason can still guide us in how we live our lives and make choices.
So it's not about finding all the answers. It's more about learning to ask the right questions and, living with the uncertainty.
I like that. Living with the uncertainty. That's a great way to put it. And that's maybe the greatest legacy of both Leibniz and Kant. They showed us that philosophy isn't about building these airtight systems, but about engaging in this ongoing conversation, this constant questioning and searching for deeper understanding.
And that conversation is, it's still going on today, isn't it? We're also grappling with these big questions, trying to figure out our place in the universe.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes studying philosophy so exciting and rewarding. It's not about memorizing a bunch of, dead guys' ideas. It's about joining this living tradition of inquiry, of pushing ourselves to think more deeply and critically about the world and our place in it.
So to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and who knows, maybe someday you'll be part of the conversation too. And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive into Leibniz versus Kant. We'll see you next time for another philosophical adventure.